The first task of grief is to accept the reality of the loss. This is coming full face with the reality that that person is dead, or the relationship is over, or the part of your body is gone forever, and that they will not be returning. The opposite of accepting the reality of the loss is not believing through some type of denial. This can happen in several ways. Mummification refers to retaining the dead person's possessions ready for use as if they will return to use them at any moment. This is normal in the short term, but it becomes mummification and denial if it goes on for years after the loss. Minimizing the loss is perceiving the loss as less significant than it actually was. Statements such as, "We weren't close," "He was a bad father anyway," or "I don't miss them," are often heard with this type of denial. This can also be seen in people who immediately get rid of every personal item or reminder of the dead person, so that they don't have to be confronted with the fact that the person is dead. Selective forgetting involves blocking all reality of the dead person or the lost thing or relationship that has ended, and trying to remove them from your memory or reality. Denying that death is irreversible can look like saying, "I don't want them to be dead. I don't want this thing to be gone. I don't want this relationship to be over." Repeating that over and over when in fact the person is already dead, the thing is already gone, or the relationship is already over. Middle knowledge is both knowing and not knowing at the same time. This is often seen in those who have a terminal illness. They logically know that they are dying, but emotionally they do not fully believe it. Coming to an acceptance of the reality of the loss takes time, since it involves not only an intellectual acceptance, but also an emotional one. Those who have experienced loss may be intellectually or mentally aware of the finality of the loss long before the emotions allow full acceptance of the information as true. Traditional rituals, such as funerals, can help those who are grieving move towards acceptance. Those who are not present for traditional rituals may need other external ways to validate the reality of the death. This can be used by going to visit the gravesite or reading the obituary. Our second task is to process the pain of grief. The German word Schmerz fits well with the pain of grief because its broad definition includes the literal physical pain that many experience and the emotional and behavioral pain associated with loss. Not everyone experiences the same intensity of pain or feels it in the same way, but it is nearly impossible to lose someone or something with whom you were deeply attached without experiencing some level of pain. Although the pain of grief is most often thought about in terms of sadness, as we explored earlier, there are many other feelings and sensations associated with grief that also need to be processed, such as anger, anxiety, guilt, loneliness, etc. This task can be made more difficult because of society's expectations. People who have not experienced loss may be uncomfortable with your feelings related to grief, and hence may give off the impression that you do not need to continue to grieve. Platitudes such as, "You are young and will have another child," "They would want you to be happy," "You can just have a breast reconstruction," are often used in an attempt to be helpful. However, these comments go directly against how grief wants you to act and can cause an internal struggle of needing to grieve versus thinking that you are being sorry for yourself, wanting attention, or carrying on for too long. The opposite of processing the pain of grief is not feeling anything. This can happen in several ways: by cutting off feelings and denying the pain, idealizing the dead, avoiding any reminders of the dead, using drugs or alcohol, and believing the dead are better off to such a point where the death is seen as a positive or a mercy, and therefore it cannot be painful. Repressing, ignoring, or otherwise not processing the pain of grief causes significant problems later on. It can lead to depression or even to prolonged grief disorder. One way to help accomplish this task is by writing letters to the person who died, or the relationship that ended, or the breast that is now gone, etc. This may help you resolve feelings such as anger or guilt. Other people use art as a way of expression, for example, by doodling your feelings instead of writing them. Our third task is to adjust to a world without the deceased. A caveat here is that this task may take years to complete and can often be quite painful. However, it's worth it in the long run. There are 3 areas of adjustment that need to be addressed after the loss of someone to death or other non-death related types of losses. The first is external adjustments. Adjusting to an environment without the deceased means different things to different people, depending on what the relationship was with the deceased and the various roles that they played. In any grief journey, it is seldom clear exactly what was lost. For example, the death of a husband may or may not mean the loss of a sexual partner, a companion, an accountant, a gardener, a baby minder, a listener, a bed warmer, and so on. Often we are not aware of all the roles someone played in our lives until they die. Many survivors resent having to develop new skills and taking on roles that used to be done by the person who died. This is a true example. A young mother's husband died. Her husband was the type of person who was very efficient and took charge of situations and did a lot of things for her. After he died, one of the widow's children got in trouble, and she had to have a meeting with the guidance counselor at school. Previously, her husband would have made contact with the school and handled everything, but now this young mother was forced to develop this skill. Although she developed it reluctantly and with resentment, she did eventually come to the awareness that she liked having the skill to handle such a situation competently, and that she never would have accomplished this if her husband was still alive. This coping strategy is called redefining the loss, and it involves looking at the loss in such a way that it can become to the benefit of a survivor. And the use of this skill is often a successful completion of task 3. The second type of adjustment is internal adjustments. Death presents us with the challenge of adjusting to our own sense of self. This goes beyond seeing ourselves as widows, orphans, bereaved parents, etc., but more fundamentally, how death affects self-definition, self-esteem, and a sense of self-efficacy. One goal within this task is to view yourself as a full self, rather than half of a dyad. This is the difference between asking yourself, what would my husband have done? But asking yourself, what would I do? There are some relationships where your self-esteem is dependent on the person who has now died. For example, after the death of a spouse, one may think, no one will love me like they did, and I will never find a place to belong again. In this example, that person ought to work to contradict such feelings, knowing that their desire did not disappear just because someone died. Bereavement can also affect someone's sense of self-efficacy, which is the degree to which you feel you have some control over what happens to you. This can cause people to feel helpless, inadequate, incapable, or even childlike. Those who are grieving need to relearn the world after a death and focus on the impact of the death on your own sense of self. Address the following questions. How am I different from loving him or her? And who am I now? Usually, over time, negative self-images usually give way to more positive ones, and survivors are able to carry on with their lives and learn new ways of dealing with the world. Our third type of adjustment is spiritual adjustments. This is an adjustment to one's sense of the world. Grieving is an attempt to reconstruct a world of meaning that has been challenged by loss. Death can shake the foundation of your assumptions about the world. Loss through death or otherwise can challenge your life values and philosophical beliefs. It is not unusual for bereaved to feel as though they have lost all direction in life. Those who are grieving often search for meaning in the loss to regain a feeling of control. There are 3 basic assumptions that can be challenged by a significant loss. The world is a benevolent place. The world makes sense. And you are worthy. Such challenges are also more likely to occur with a violent or untimely death. Mothers who lose their young children, for example, may think, "I must be a bad person for this to have happened." Not all deaths, however, challenge basic beliefs. For example, the appropriate death of an elderly person after a well-lived life can fit expectations and validate our assumptions about the world. The opposite of the completion of task 3 results from a failure to adapt to the loss. People may work against themselves by promoting their own helplessness, by not developing the skills they need to cope, or by withdrawing from the world and not facing up to their requirements. Our 4th task is to remember the deceased while embarking on the rest of one's journey through life. This task involves finding a place for the deceased that will enable you to memorialize them, but in a way that will not hinder you from going on with life. We need to find a way to memorialize our dead loved ones, keeping them with us, but still going on with life. We will never altogether forget the dead person or the relationship or whatever was lost, and we will never lose how much they meant to us. We instead need to find an appropriate place for the dead in our emotional lives, a place that will allow us to go on living effectively in the world. I really like this quote. Life goes on, and like it or not, I am part of it. Lately, there have been times when I notice how well I seem to be doing on a project at home or even taking part in an activity with friends. Some ways to accomplish this task include creating memory books, creating new rituals, or setting up a small shrine in your household. Once again, it is important to note that these tasks can be revisited and worked through again and again. This does not represent some sort of set in stone process that all grievers must go through. Now we're going to talk about the pain of grief and how to work with it. Task 2 from our tasks of grief was to identify emotions and label them and identify the trigger. This structure that I've set out here is a useful tool that you can use to fill in the blanks to help identify emotions. For example, I am grieving over the loss of my breasts. I feel angry now that I have to have another surgery. Or I feel scared that my partner won't find me attractive. Or I feel sad that my old favorite shirt looks different on me now. Studies show that simply noticing and naming our emotions can actually make them less intense.